Hi, welcome to the first edition of Compromising Positions. Thank you so much, everyone that's joined us today for the very final, the last hurrah of the Leeds Digital Festival. And what a festival it has been. I've been to lots of events myself, had a really good time. If you do not know what the Leeds Digital Festival is, where have you been? You need to look that up and get ready for next year. It's every second half of September. It's a really fantastic event. I believe we had 300 tech events in Leeds this year, both virtually and in person, which was very nice. And yeah, we are, Jeff, the very closing event. But who are we? Jeff, introduce yourself.
I'm Jeff Watkins. I'm currently CTO for a consultancy called XDesign. My path into cybersecurity was one more of curiosity at first, really, and then I actually spent some time studying it at the master's level, and I've founded numerous cybersecurity committees and security teams. Lianne.
I'm Lianne Potter. I'm head of security operations for a major retailer in the UK. And when I'm not doing the techie side of things, I could be found as the Anthropologist, which is cyber anthropology. So anthropology is the study of what makes us human. So the study of cyber anthropology is how we engage with the practice of cybersecurity from a cultural angle. And throughout these discussions, compromising positions, and I'll tell you more about where that name came from in a second, we're going to be talking to really interesting people from all walks of life that are not from the security team. That is our unique selling point. That is our hook. We're going to be talking to people who work in the data field, engineering, architecture, but outside of tech as well. So we've got psychologists, people who work in compliance, behavioral scientists, economists, and all that kind of things that makes the world go around, and to ask them the question, who is the compromising position here? Now, when we talk about compromising positions, I think about it as there's two things to think. There is the compromising position in terms of what security need to do and be a bit more compromising with their asks. And then there's the other side of it is security doesn't really have a great rap in most businesses. It's often seen as one of the blockers to getting things done, innovation. Quite a lot of people would rather not talk to us. So if that is the case, then could we actually be the compromising positions? Because if nobody's talking to us, the implication being that maybe people are doing insecure, naughty behavior. So we do need to ask ourselves, are we the compromising position? And Jeff, tell us a little bit more about the amazing speakers we've already been recording that'll be coming weekly every Thursday for our listeners.
Oh God, we've recorded maybe 10 or so far. I mean, I think we started with Christian Hunt, who was very interesting indeed. We've had Steve Traps and
I've just seen actually, just that went past is our other co-host, which is your cat.
So and Matt Ballantyne is very, very interesting as well.
So we've just got loads of guests that are on the hook for us that are going to come and give us some amazing insights. I mean, literally when I've been speaking to our guests, there's been so many times when I've just had like my synapses just ping all over the place and go, that actually is something I can definitely apply in my organization tomorrow. And it's been just an absolutely wonderful journey to go on and ask some really kind of tough questions about security. And in that vein, our very first special guest for our inaugural episode, it's a man who I think needs no introduction, but I'm going to do so anyway. To say he is a trailblazer would be not going far enough, in my opinion. This is a chap who, for me, I can't do without in terms of whenever I have any new starters or whenever I'm speaking to a business that maybe tech isn't their main focus. This is the book I pull out, and it's a book which he was a co-author of. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in saying it's one of the most important tech books in the last decade. That book is The Phoenix Project. And today we have our co-author of that book, Kevin Behr. Hello, Kevin.
Hello. Just remember, my last name is weird because it looks German, but is actually pronounced Behr.
Apologies.
Yeah, but and it's not the animal. That would be bar. But yeah, no worries. And it's good to be with you guys today. So I'm excited to kind of get into what we're going to talk about.
Well, for those that don't know you, do you want to explain a little bit about your background?
Oh my God. Basically, I started out in tech at a very young age, and my father had the like he was basically in the Navy when I was a kid, and was working in microwave and in tech at a very, early in the 70s. His father repaired televisions in the 50s. So we've had this kind of lineage of electronics engineers going back, at least 3 generations in our family. So as a kid, I really didn't have much choice. And, by age 7, I was blowing myself off of, stools in the garage with, electricity. So I always had the curiosity of how things worked and what made them work. And so I had a litany of things taken half apart and never been able to put back together again, just trying to understand it. So, it was funny. As a child, my mother joked with me that, I don't know how many tape recorders she bought me. And I'm talking about just like the simple mono little tape recorders, because I would take them apart and do things with them and speed them up, slow them down, play with the heads, and just really wanted to, figure out how to make them sound better. And so my mom used to joke that if anybody wanted to know what I wanted as a gift, she was like, just get him a cheap tape recorder because he always needs one. It became a metaphor for really wanting to understand why people did things. And I think, as a young tech kid, worked early on, worked in software until I figured out that was not my calling. And just kind of the neurodivergent way I'm wired, I think I started to realize that it wasn't so much ADD was a bad thing. It was really one of the ways that I was able to learn how to get a purview of things. So, as a CIO, which I've been in the past, and a CTO, which I've also been in the past, in different kinds of organizations, going from the startup world and also working in global, corporate situations. I think the one constant has always been the ability of executives to really understand what's happening at an operational level in their company with enough savvy and enough discipline to not get pulled into each escalation. But and so one of the things I've really kind of been learning both the hard way and through the network of CIOs that I work with in my business, that I feel like it's a really hard journey, and the ability of people to lead and make effective change in an organization is really, really, really confusing and hard and unpredictable. And for our kind of mass manufacturing paradigm that we've been in for quite some time, predictability has always been kind of nirvana for that world, right? Trying to basically then we can optimize based on steady performance, right? There's always these methodologies and all of these great thinkers that have been in that space. And so I really feel like as execs, and from my past and my experience has been, things failing to work, from ideas that start with executives or ideas that start anywhere that have to traverse, organizational layers or stratums. And it's worse than telephone, the game, that we've heard, right? Or whisper down the list, right? And because there's the parity bits aren't even the same between the 3 layers of company. I mean, when you look at the executive or the kind of top functions in an organization, they speak a completely different language than people that are doing work, right? If you ever want to see that, kind of conversation handoff, that to one person seems really clear what they asked for, and to another feels like a drive-by shooting, right? Like, but they have to pretend that it's perfectly okay and that they're going to do it, and it'll be certain. Right. Like, and that handoff is really missing something like trust. Right? It's certainly the feeling of it. Maybe the executive really does trust you, but you have no way of knowing it. And you can't make it grok. A lot of the times they're speaking in pictures. And as an engineer, you're like, okay, so I get global synergy. But what does that mean when I have to configure this freaking router? Like, I don't understand why you want me to do things that aren't natural. And really, there's not even, that's not happening. You know what I mean, in the conversation. And so I think I was always intrigued because I was an engineer, still working, like I said, developing. And then I was working on the networking side of things, because from year 1982 to freaking 2000, it was the year of the network every freaking year in some magazine, right? And so I really was into networking. And from that perspective, it was like social anthropology. In a weird way, the way things are connected really determines and flows from, it's kind of the same kind of theory that happens. The organizational wiring basically is how your network's going to freaking wire, and eventually that's how it's going to be segmented, and eventually that's how everybody's going to communicate. It's like, it's the same thing. What we're going to say,
kind of taking Conway's law another step further into networking.
It's just a social thing. It's a social phenomena, I think, right? That the thing that humans do is continually trying to divide and understand the more complex something is. And there's a point that has complete diminishing returns, right? And so, yeah, the compromising, I think a lot of times as an exec, I've experienced where, I look at what's between the layers, like what's missing. How are we traversing, right? Strategy to capability to tactics, right? And what I find is that, like with security, the agreement never happened in an actual adult way about technology. Right.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, I have a theory of it, and it's not necessarily correct, but what I saw, growing up with my father in the mainframe world, and that's really where I got my start, was working in mainframes, and the system 370s and 360s. My dad was involved in that project with the OS for the 360 back in the day. If you've never read Mythical Man Month, it's one of the shortest books, but it's a journal of a failed project. Actually, it was ultimately a success because OS 360 really kind of changed everything. But I still think that a lot to be learned about adding resources to make things go faster. Just does. And so I think the agreement that I feel like happened, which is that, really when you look at how computing happened, it was very much a scientific thing. And early on, because of when the big dawn of computing happened, a lot of it was during World War II, right? And so women really were at the forefront of computing. And I think this is something that is really hard for a lot of people to understand, how we would have none of the things that we have if it would not been for like 10 women, right? Like, and so I'm sure we would have come up with things different ways, but it's really, really important to understand that this is not a men's world. It never was. Only in the last 20, 30 years has it become this way, right? And so I think, first of all, from the inclusiveness side of things, our constraints outside the world, from the world standpoint, really, really can allow us to see how we can rethink things. If we have to, we could shift the workforce massively to women and not experience any loss, and matter of fact, experience gains.
Have you ever heard, Kevin, of what's known as the Beatles effect?
Yes,
which
exactly.
Which is one of the theories, just for the listeners, one of the theories of why there was such a shift in women doing computing was they call it the Beatles effect. So when the Beatles first came out, obviously a lot of teenage girls really liked the Beatles, and they were shouting and screaming, going mad, pulling at their clothes and everything like that. But when men wanted to kind of get into the Beatles, they were like, oh, right, no, the Beatles needed to change to be nice and moody and do all the artsy stuff, which the White Album and things like that. And so there was this shift in allegiance, and a lot of people say that the shift from women programmers to a more male dominated industry is called the Beatles effect. As soon as it became kind of cool to do, then it became, well, this is the domain for men because it's cool to do now. So I watched a really interesting documentary about that. And I just thought, that makes sense. As a side note, I like the Beatles from HN. So
well, and finance was like that too, right? I mean, if you think about, all of those roles were increasingly performed by women during the war, and especially I think more so in what now is the UK, right? And there's quite a history of it. It's actually one of the things that I love to watch is just the kind of unknown different things that was happening in World War II in the UK and Great Britain. But the thing I was saying is it largely computing came in, the first computer, right, was IBM's time clock in the 1800s, right? I think we can say that was the first one used by business. And so when you start kind of in that space, and I'm sure there's something before that, but that's the one that's widely known. And so from a business perspective, the idea was working on costs, right? So we got brought in as a way to save because and Ellie Goldratt really had this basic axiom, which sounds really obvious, but it's not, because it takes you down a box. If you ever get a chance to listen to Beyond the Goal, which is an audio recording that he did, that's basically like a little thesis that he develops with you, and it's really, really tough if you buy into what he says at the beginning, which is basically this notion that technology can provide value if and only if it removes a business limitation. And so the problem that we've always had as humans, I think, I know it's one of the many problems, is we love to create things to solve problems, ever since we figured out that a piece of straw could get ants to climb up it when we could put it in our mouth. That was technology, right? That made it easier and we could do it faster, get more ants, more value. And so we've always looked at these things to solve problems because engineering has always been at the forefront of it, really, because nobody understood this stuff, right? It was science.
Yeah.
Even though really when you look at what science is, it's really not a science. It's engineering.
I found the same over the years. I've seen a lot of business technology and people trying to implement new systems, and quite often you're doing this because you're working around the way your organization is without actually resolving the organizational difficulty, rather than trying to challenge the forefront of technology.
Right. Well, exactly. That saying about, that's been said different ways about basically any good technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think from the executive layer, computing brought in to solve largely accounting problems at first and actually existed in the context of accounting and finance. Like that's where they were used. They owned the mainframe. Of course they were smart and charged everybody for it, but that's where it existed. And so
what's interesting about that is, if I think about anthropology, and actually the first, the reason why a lot of us began writing, sort of in anger, is round about the Egyptian times, and they say one of the first kind of proper tomes of writing. So not talking about cave paintings, but the proper tomes of writing was to do with writing who owes what in a bill, and it was transactional. So we've always been driven by this kind of transactional nature. It's like, almost zeros and ones, like, you owe me this, and therefore I'm going to create a log of it. So it's really interesting that it's kind of gone around that way.
And no matter what kind of society you have, how it's organized, that's the basis. Inside of there, things must be accounted for, and no matter how they're produced or who owns them. And so I think the bringing in to solve the problems of accounting, which are things, by the way, we're in this space where, AI again has popped into our kind of ADHD minds right now. I mean, it's literally makes no sense to me, half the things I read about AI, and especially just around the large language models that are going on right now. The notion, I'm not a believer in artificial intelligence. I am a believer in automated intelligence. I do believe that computers will never do the things that our minds do because they're not biological in organisms. But I believe that we invented computers unknowingly, or maybe we didn't realize, but they do everything that we're terrible at. Right? Detail, like calculations instantly, all these things that we're just terrible at. And the things we're really, amazing at and excel as humans, computers are terrible at. Reasoning, gray, understanding, making judgment calls, like all these things that we have to do with low levels of information. Computers require large is a understatement when you look at the language models, right? And that's just to be what we would consider as smart as a 3-year-old in some cases, right? And the way decision making is happening. And so I think what we're going to find is that the way we teach our children is the same problem that we have when we teach our computers. And it's all the biases and all of the things that happen that we're not conscious of. right? It's like kids when they figure out their parents were alcoholics when they were growing up during their, single digit years. They're like, oh, that's why there was all of this conflict all the time out of nowhere, right? Like, that shaped them and they didn't realize it, right? So we have that same thing with technology. There's been this notion to solve problems. So there's optimization around calculations, right? My dad was early involved in like control data, which, had Cray's first mainframes, and and then we worked with him at several different companies. I actually worked for a company owned by Cray and a couple of other companies myself, and so the engineering side is really cool. But when we come in to solve these problems, which is where the promise is for value for the business, right? To get that technology.
Yeah.
Part of the fundamental agreement that wasn't really made explicitly was, in order to get value out of this stuff, it's CIA. We have to build a actual program around this, not just security, it's operational security. And at the end of the day, if putting it in is the small investment, it's the operating. And matter of fact, operating is the only place where we harvest value from assets.
Yeah.
Right? They create value by running. And so, we love to focus on development. Unless you're a software company, very little value out of building software. It's running software that gives us value. And so, the idea that we are continually putting things in with the promise, development is promise of future value, and, also protecting revenue, because operations is largely protecting revenue. And I think a lot of people, when you start to think about the resistance you get moving into operations, where basically, hopefully, everybody understands they're running on scale, because certainly somebody's seeing their budget drop every year and the stuff they have increase, right? So it's really hard for them to achieve mastery over anything when everything's novel. And I think security folks have this inherent understanding, right, of being, reduced to using detective controls to figure out what the F we have out there, right? We're continually having to learn about stuff that's already happening, right? That produces cynicism, right?
So, I guess, you've held a number of different executive roles and vast amount of experience in the industry across different organizations. What's been your personal experience with cybersecurity teams, and what's been the challenge, and what's the good that you've seen there?
I think some of my favorite people in security, and it changes. It's more of a mindset that I really love. And I hate the term mindset because everybody loves to use it. It's meaningless. It's like transformation right now, or self-care. But the things that we need to do but aren't sufficient sometimes to actually get what we want. But yeah, I think I see kind of the fun, like I talked about, the fundamental security agreement, this notion that we have this social contract where the way we operate something has the future in mind. Right now, the way we operate oftentimes has the past in mind. And like you were talking about, the organizational context that this stuff comes out of. I don't know how many large companies I've been in, but there's a cliche about anytime they buy packaged software, what they do to it. Oh my God. Customization, right? And the reason they have to do all of this, half of it is organizational issues, right, that have been created over the year by the way things don't work and people problem solve. So people, Goldwright used to talk about how people optimize locally, right, for what's around them. And so security, since it's a language nobody speaks, but security and maybe some network people and maybe some developers, even fewer, right? But it becomes the sodality in a company. Half the crap that you talk about is what we would call backside conversations. Like these are the things that are not for wide distribution, right? For a lot of reasons. And so what can happen is the self-optimization. It's the same thing as the network people, right? As a former network guy, I know that every outage is a network problem until you prove it's not, which is the dumbest thing ever, because one time it was, right? When you statistically look at what fails, it's stuff that people failed with ideas, software, right? And so and also things that we meant to do. Like it's the consequences of work we meant to do is failure, right? So nobody just usually tries to cause mayhem. And so they intend something better. And so I think, when you look at the fact that we never really thought in the first place how this was going to operate, and then we also look at the other thing, until the PC happened, a lot of these things were integrated and it was a discipline, right?
Yeah.
So as a mainframe operator, you learn about how you run jobs, how you schedule things, how you interact with the command line interfaces, how some of these jobs require somebody to sit there and hit any key every 4 hours, like backups or something like that, all these scripts that are running and batch jobs. So there was much more of an understanding about, maybe a little bit shallower level of understanding about a lot more things. And then there was always the mainframe manufacturer that you could call for like the really detailed stuff, and they tell you where to press it to make it better, right? So the things that that understanding changed whenever we hit client server.
Yeah.
So the first thing that happened was we needed a network person anyway, because God knows we had to network everything. Nobody really knew why. I think the shared drive became this amazing thing. Printing, which, dear God, never worked to begin with, and then now network printing. I swear half the CIOs at one time back in the 80s were just somebody that figured out how to make it print for the CEO. Like, I can't print.
I still think that's a skill today. Sometimes when I go back into the office, it's usually because I need to print something. And I get my steps in, just going back and forth. It's not working. Go back and forth.
Yeah, it's like the only more neurotic person than a security person in your organization is somebody who manages print queues. Like, like, why won't it go? But yeah, I do think that fundamental bargain is hard first to know, because computing is so emergent. Like I said, when you look at how it flowed through different areas of a company, finance finally kicked it out because they were too slow to change in many cases. Like, literally the answer was no to everything. Like, well, could you, could we make this tweak to the way, the batch reports run or whatever? Well, that's risky. We can't test that. Or if they could, if they had test bench or something like that, people would nobody wants to get in trouble. And I could tell you, most of that conditioning comes from when things break. And so the fundamental misunderstanding about how these things operate, how there are things that are out of our control, they're looked at as problem solvers, and they're automatic. They're robots. And in most people's minds, robots don't need oil. They don't need care and feeding. They don't need anything. So operating should be cheap, because the hardest part is to get it to work, right? That's why I hire people that know everything. Like, we've conditioned each other in layers of management and layers of doing that the other side doesn't get it.
And I think that's one of the kind of problems with the cybersecurity industry now. When I think about all the times I've been hired in a cybersecurity position, aside from the cybersecurity team, everyone else expects me to know everything there is to know about cybersecurity, and I mean everything. So I started off my tech career as a software developer. Now, theoretically, I could say, okay, I'm going to just focus. I'm going to be the biggest expert on JavaScript. I could just literally blinkers focus on that, for example. In cybersecurity, I can't do that because everything touches, all the tech touches cybersecurity. So I've got to know something about networks. I've got to know something about the cloud, AI, software development, every kind of component. I've got to know a little bit of something. People are coming to me saying, well, how do I secure this? And it's really, really difficult. And so my question to you, Kevin, is it's really difficult for me to do that as a cybersecurity person, but what would make your life easier from the cybersecurity? What gifts can we give someone in your position to make your life easier?
It's really, it's one of these funny things. I have a fascination with organizations that have to run at high speed with low certainty, with vague information. And so I kind of, I'm really into those kind of, how do people cope in emergent situations as leaders? And as I think we know how easy it is when you don't have clear direction or some sort of understanding of why things are happening, how hard it is to react to them in the moment. And so, because we're just we don't develop ourselves that way. And so when organizations do, it's really interesting to me to see how they actually figure out how both to compartmentalize information, but not compartmentalize information. And when I'm talking about, if you look at war, I really like to use humans at their worst as one of the ways to understand what's possible with humans too, and in a better way. And the truth of the matter is I feel like most of the organizational knowledge we've gotten about how to organize when things are incredibly high friction and dangerous. Bad metaphors sometimes for business, but also not. It's anytime you have to move a lot of people who all have different ideas about things in a general direction to get something done. And it's very hard. We don't like to be told what to do. And matter of fact, every new organizational paradigm I see is people wanting less and less to be told what to do. And the problem is in the companies, we've never developed our people effectively. And we've certainly not given them the beginnings of ability to start to make sense of uncertainty. And this is something that exists all in companies. Your job as an executive at the highest level is 100% social, like almost 100%. And yet, what are business people trained in? All the parts of a company that actually aren't really even physically parts. They're logical ideas and constructs. And so the thing they actually have to deal with, conflict, slowness to change. What happens is, since we're all humans, we do a lot of things as humans to cope with what we can't control. And typically this activates the worst parts of us.
Yeah.
Like, where we have obsessions, where we have compulsions, where we may have personality disorders. And it certainly doesn't mean they're diagnosed. But and even if they are, it doesn't mean somebody's over them or not trying to cope with them on a day-to-day basis, right? So as an executive, I think the things that are hardest is that most of the work you really have to do is invisible. And it doesn't make any sense. And you're not trained for it. And it's really easy to start to get very axiomatic. We will all come into the office because I'm tired of fighting about it. And if you're not here, you're fired, right?
Yeah.
You start to get this, you start to detect the fight against the social fabric of a company. And in general, hopefully the arc is that we have more and more better informed ability to kind of organize at smaller units in the organization, because we have clarity about not what we need to do specifically to make the thing happen, but where we want to be together and why we want to all be there. And then maybe there's capabilities we need to get there. And then what are the tactics that we have now that we know what their capabilities are? And so just some sort of a freaking way that people can go, oh, I get he wants to be on that hill because here's the things he has to see because we keep getting killed by this. And so we have to figure out how to do this without all getting killed, because we know that we'll get this many people killed that way, and we probably need to get less people killed because that's the general theorem of war, right? And so the idea is to have more survivors, right? And so this is one of the ways that these organizational structures get tested. And you go out there with a holacracy on the battlefield, you are mincemeat. Like literally, if you have to wonder who your boss is and what you're supposed to do because 3 people have to talk about it, that's not happening. And so, it's a bad metaphor for how intense it is in business, but not always.
Feels like a predator
autonomy.
quote.
It does.
Out here and you're in a whole world of hurt. I think
that autonomy piece, just go back, Kevin, that autonomy piece is really a good question, because when I think of autonomy, it's something I would love to give more as a gift, because obviously most cybersecurity teams are so incredibly under-resourced, and you can't have eyes on everything. You kind of rely on people to kind of give you that heads up, to kind of use your metaphors from earlier. I need someone to say, the enemy's coming, please do something about this. So it's really tough, but I also think, what you touched upon about that, almost self-preservationist is why a lot of people don't take responsibility for things. And to understand why on that RACI, for example, on which is what quite a lot of security people, put a lot of stake into, like, I need you to be responsible, accountable for these things. Nobody wants to be accountable for anything. Nobody wants to be responsible for anything, because what accountability and responsibility actually means is at some point someone is going to say to you, why did you make that decision? And nobody wants to do that. So from your perspective, how do you, because obviously you care about security, in your day-to-day life, I can tell that. So how do you bring everyone else onto that journey to care about security? How do you ever encourage people to say being on that racy, being, responsible, accountable is a good thing? Let's build a community around that, because security is everyone's responsibility, that kind of mantra.
Right. I mean, I think at this point, for most major projects in a company, whether they're, inward facing, which is probably the majority of large projects in the enterprise, or outward facing, right, is this notion of, if we get in the paper for this, negative value, like the whole thing's up. It's, either a reputation thing, or, what I'm saying, it's just no good comes from that. So the old adage that, bad exposure is still good exposure is not true, right? And so we see all the unnatural things and behaviors that people go into when they get scared. Executives doing bad things, stock buybacks, all kinds of crazy stuff. So when people get afraid, it's bad. And I think Deming really, Edwards Deming really talked about this as a fundamental concept. Whenever change needs to happen in a company, fundamentally, you need to understand why fear is happening. And as an exec, you don't get to write it off. I mean, this is the thing. I think it's so easy to dismiss what people think because it's wrong. Because sometimes it just is. People have bad information, or people see information in a way, because when they've had low information in the past and high consequences, perceived or real, right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard from people, they're afraid to do something because they might get fired. And then I look in the organization, yeah, or worse, right? And like blackballed, or, made a fool of. And so I see that, but then I think about how many times it's actually happening. It does happen. I'm not saying that it doesn't, and it may happen a lot more than I think it does, but I've seen a lot of this, and it doesn't happen correctly when it does, because I've seen habitual abusers be allowed to stay, and things. Then people make an example of somebody for one thing they did. So, like, I mean, that's the extreme, but I feel like in an organization, the ability to work together to create an understanding of both rules, because they have to have a reason to exist. So I always think about kind of what's the thing we're trying to accomplish, right? We start to think about what we'd like to have in the end. And then we start to think about, okay, well, what do we need to have that? Like, what would it be like to have these things? And these aren't conversations that we often get to have. They're more philosophical, right? And matter of fact, the patience for business philosophy ends at directors, because they're the ones who have to say, okay, I get what you're saying. I totally get it. And you're right. But that guy up there is binary. And we're either on his message or we're fighting it.
I wonder if some of it's kind of there's a kind of, I think people are, from my experience, really bad at dealing with the ambiguity of change, and really good at ignoring the risk of not changing. As in, this works for now. If I continue to stick my head in the sand, it'll continue working beyond my retirement. When the risk is of not changing and not upgrading and not redeveloping and not securing something, well, it's working at the moment until the next day you come in and it's suddenly not, and your entire bank relies on this.
Right. And because, somebody with a title really, really pushed us to do something. And I think this, one of the reasons why I was so interested in the idea of the Phoenix Project was, at the beginning, was my career, I realized one day, has basically been doing translation between layers, being a boundary spanner. And I think that as executives, that is becoming more and more a requirement for us. And I don't think a lot of us like that. I mean, some of us have had pasts where, like, I had to deal with this with myself sometimes, where you've had things that have hurt you or traumatized you that you bring through your life, and they can cause things that you don't even realize are happening. Like, you might withdraw and become narcissistic when pressure really happens. And as execs, the joke is that they're all a bunch of narcissists, right? And I've actually found that if you think about their roles, Akoff used to make the clever observation that the higher you move in an organization, the less you know about more things. But the more you move to where the doing happens, the more you know about less things. And so what you have to think about as an executive, the information physics are, they may not have the breadth of what you're talking about, they're worried that what you're talking about doesn't have any depth. And right. And so that middle layer of an organization talks about capabilities, not just tactics. For too long, our executives have been telling us how to do things. And so when you look at how teams self-organize, we talked about this a little before. I really, really love some of the examples that we learned from World War II with Rommel. It turns out Rommel wasn't the genius. It was the fact that he was in command of the Prussian army in Africa. And the Prussian army is very different from the German army, right? And which is that, you know, they had these two guys, Clausewitz and Moltke, over different years. One of them never even fought a war, the general. They designed this system called mission command. Literally,
Right.
it's what our military has been trying to adopt for going on 30, 40 years. And it's the notion that, you know, generals and people that are in charge need to speak in intents. And then people that have the ability to build capabilities to achieve those intents, like how do we organize? How do we actually train? How do we actually deploy, right? Because if we can't do those things, you're never going to get to doing tactics, right? Like, you know, like fighting the actual thing, right? So like when you start to have folks that are looking at least 3 layers, because sometimes it's a lot more than that, but like saying, and actually working together to say, okay, I've got this crazy idea. I want to build this thing that it feels like this, it does this, and it solves these problems. I'm going to know that we've done it right because these things happen. And I'm going to know we're failing if it sounds like this. I'm hearing conversations that sounds like this. I'm hearing reports that sound like this. Then I'm going to get involved, right? So now people are like, oh, here's where you're going to get involved. That's something we don't want. That's bad. Here's what you're saying are your intents. That means we have something abstract to work with whenever we can't make sense of complexity. We can go, okay, this doesn't matter from his perspective, because at the end of the day, it's all these little details that he's not talking about. So we have freedom to decide. We have agency in here to look at how we're going to do this, right? So when you basically come up with what you need, you start to think about capability-wise, that's operations, right? Is you think, hey, how do we create value? What problem are we solving here? So there's layers of software, there's solutioning in here, right? About building capability. And then there's other capabilities you need to do that, like infrastructure capability to run those things. Right. But then you're starting to slide into this area where we have all of our experts that we have in our business. And we say, now, here's the capability you have. Here's the kind of vehicles you have. Here's the course you need to drive. What do you need to do to drive this course? And here's your car. Right. Oh, well, I have the wrong car. No, you don't. This is what we can do. Right. Right. Because that's the first thing every engineer wants to do. And so, you know, that notion is makes it more coherent, because when people are doing a tactic, and this is the thing that nobody could explain, you know, when these tank divisions were out there and they weren't using communications at all to talk to anybody because they had their intent from Rommel. They asked him to say, how do you want this to look when it's done? Right. What do you want to feel like? Right. And kind of get that whole picture, so that word picture can then translate in, okay, we need these tanks to do this, and we need these, you know, small arms troops to do this. And they could come up with what they needed. And then they came up with the tactics. And then the tactics were known by the teams. And they knew whenever their plan ran out, like they blew through the line in a blitzkrieg, or that whole approach that they were using to move really fast, right? Not so much in Africa, but when they attacked and won, they knew what to do when their objective was met, because they still knew the intent of the commander. Oh, yeah. We did the thing, but he said in general, this is a sign of success. So we're just going to keep making signs of success. We don't need to talk to each other to do that. We all know what our role is, right? And so the way you move information sometimes can allow your teams to operate with less information, right? They can actually I hate to say the word blinders, like on horses, but we all have different stimulus, and neurodiversity really brings this into focus for me. And a lot of times you'll see people put headphones on. These are things to constrain our senses. Because sensory activity overloads our brain and it's hard to focus. So less things means more focus that are going through our brain. Right? And so we do things like earphones. Some people don't do this, but horses really don't want all of this because it freaks them out. Right? And so we wonder what organizational silos are, They're a human extension of our ability to focus, and management's belief over time that the more focused we are on smaller amounts of things, that's why span of control is so small in a lot of companies, then we're going to be better at it and we can optimize it, right? Because our weakness is all the things that computers are good at, right? So we've socially built that stuff into our organizations. So when we're designing solutions, sometimes we're working around things like, the thing I told you about Goldratt's saying, right? About how in order for something to provide value in a business, it must diminish a limitation, right? Well, one of the things is we diminish limitations all the time, but we fail to understand the rules that existed before we got rid of the limitation. In other words, how did they live with the situation? Because if we don't explicitly expose that and change those rules when we put the new, solution into place, I mean, if the solution was as simple as removing a log from the trail that they now don't have to try and get across every time, but because we didn't change the rule, even though we removed the log, they all still try and step over something that's not there. We then don't get the value of doing the work. It's a really kind of silly way of saying it. And so when we don't think about, first of all, even from a security perspective, what were the rules that allowed these people to function when they were doing this problem before? Now that we want to do the problem different, and we want a different outcome, how do we talk about this together to go, no, here's what it should feel like if I solve what you're saying, right? The notion of back briefing. It's really important when I talked about the mission command thing, where I was talking about the 3 layers, because the first thing I do when I give you my intent is say, what did you hear from me, to the operational layer? And they'll repeat back to you, this is what I heard you say. Oh my God, how many times did we just run off after a meeting with all of our notes and we solve a problem only to find out, that's not really what I want. You come back to the exec and you start that game I call Bring Me Another Rock. I don't know what I want. I want something else, right? And you go, okay, I'll go get another one. And then you bring back the other one. And they're like, that's close. How is it close? I
can't articulate it. And as humans, we are absolutely terrible at articulating our wants and needs. And I think that's probably why they're saying that AI prompt generators are going to be like the next big thing, because people are worried about AI taking people's jobs, but we are terrible at articulating things. So only the very best people at articulating what they want AI to generate are actually going to really succeed in this area. Yes. But Kevin, it's been fantastic so far, but we would be remiss. There was one question that came up time and time again when we told people we were speaking to you. May we, towards the end of this session, ask you that question?
Absolutely.
So that question is, go Jeff.
Yeah, so it's been, is it now, I think it's the 10th anniversary, somewhere around this year, isn't it, of the Phoenix project?
So, 2014, 2015, somewhere in there. Yeah, it's getting close.
So obviously the world of tech and the world of cybersecurity and cybercrime and threats has changed a lot since it was written in some ways. Do you think you'd change anything if you were from a security angle, if you were going to update it for a new edition or a sequel?
Well, I think socially the struggle is often there. And sadly, I think in some organizations, the archetype of law enforcement still exists in the security situation where, the notion of it's not a job of security to accept risk. Okay, but maybe it starts with, what is the risk that we're asking you to accept, and what does that look like? And here's how we should consult on this, right? But we can't be the end voice, because a lot of times we don't realize in the organization that part of the business's value, how it generates value and competes, is because of the way it manages a certain kind of risk better than anybody else can. We are good at taking these kinds of risks and managing them. This is why we make money. People don't want to do this if they're not good at it, because it's risky. Accounting, anything, right? And so part of the notion of business and how we make our space for ourselves involves basically how do we manage the basic risks. And we've lost perspective because, first of all, the amount of detail that explodes the more technology you put in place to actually solve problems, right? And you get the swallow the spider to catch the fly effect, the more systems you have, right? It's bad. I mean, right now, like with antidepressants and all of the side effects, now we're getting pills that you take for the side effects of the pills that you're taking.
Yeah.
And so, and the side effects of those pills are always the thing that they're trying to cure. So I think, this notion of anytime we build solutions, there's not a way to be able to discuss what's going to happen because it's completely emergent. And so the trust problem, which is what allows that whole notion of, building vision, capabilities, and tactics in an organization, those layers must trust each other. I have to trust that if I give you $1 million, you're not going to go buy cars, you're going to buy tanks. And that's not really tanks, plural. That's barely a part of a tank, right? But my point is that, I know that you're not going to take those tanks and sell them on eBay. And, matter of fact, there's actually an analogy about that, how one of our commanders was overseas and he was talking to another commander of a foreign nation. And the guy said, you're a pretty terrible general. And he's like, okay, I'm not going to say you're wrong, but why do you think I'm a terrible general? Right. First of all, not overreactive. But he said, well, listen, I can't trust my people. Like if I gave them 100 tanks, 50 of them would end up on eBay.
Hmm.
Your people don't steal from you. And they don't, they have this idea that they should listen to what you say, even when it might get them killed. And, that you don't have to be good to manage those people. And he was like, I can see what you're saying. And we only move as fast as our trust, our collective trust. And I think this is part of that idea is, what are we trusting in together? What is this solution supposed to deliver? And not only that, beyond it gets rid of this problem, what are you going to trust about how it's going to get rid of this problem in terms of how we keep that happening? Because that's really the problem. It's not, can we get it running? We have so few problems that our folks can't figure out. Like from a tech perspective, I don't think we have, other than things people say things can do that they don't, which is a lot, because marketing, right? But the notion that that our problems are largely technical, I think are not true. I think our problems are largely social, and the interaction of the way we've actually decided to play with technology, like the way we engage. So, kind of like, what would I change about the security perspective of it? I think that we have to figure out how to make security less of a sub-optimization or a local optimization for the folks that feel like they're responsible for what happens. Because at the end of the day, the sodality, in other words, smaller group, think like a religious group. You have the parishioners, and then you have the lay people, and then you have this smaller group of the elders, the pastors, or whatever you call them, chaplains in your organization. But that smaller group is a sodality, more believer, like tighter, right, closer to the center. And so the sodality that we have in security is a smaller subset of people that know a lot more. But security is weird because there's this incredible layers of detail that we need, but then, and I used to always take that seriously, because the layers of detail and how you transcend them in security are very much like what the business needs to do. And then this conversation about business value with security is just, it's so bass backwards, because it's not the requirement of how we solve all the problems in the beginning. When somebody comes from the business, they don't say this. You don't hear this line usually. Sometimes you do. I need to make sure that when we solve this problem, that we do it in a way that really means we solved this problem, that we're continuing as we operate to solve this problem. I need to take care of this thing. So I'm concerned both about how much it costs to get it started and our opportunity cost of all the other things we've got, i.e. technical debt, right? And I want to basically understand those two things, because if I don't understand how much it's costing to keep up the stuff we've got, and how much it's getting worse, that we get behind, I got to really understand that, because I want to put new big things in those pipelines, not development pipelines, the throughput of solutions, the integration of everything that has to happen, right? We don't have execs that are coherent about value streams. In other words, how does the value get made for all of these things, and understanding that as you traverse the different parts of an organization in those value streams, the security is literally in every step. And in a lot of organizations, the ratio of people that are in security means there's not very many of them compared to the large organization. So people's names are on the value stream. And when you look at it and you build it,
Yeah.
that is the absolute, if in a big company or a company that's scaling, that is the opposite, right, of actually scaling and getting flow. And so I think it's really important to understand that security is not built in the notion of a value stream for an ultimate solution. It's always, 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 we talk about building it in, shift left, all this stuff. It's still thought about after inception. It's still thought about. It's not the modifying quality of the way we do everything, because the basic agreement about what it means to get value here is that we don't get in the newspapers, right? That it continues to operate and is available to all the right people, and all the stuff stays confidential, right? Like, and to me, the integrity of the data is really important as well. But I think that whole agreement has gotten out of the gate behind the solution, because we are known for solving problems with cool gadgets and magic that don't require care and feeding, because the stuff is made out of metal, silicon, and text, right? Like, so we've got to get rid of this notion, because all of the unicorn companies that we've seen over the years, all of them started by building better operations while they scaled. The thing they were good at silently is operational kung fu. Google scaled to a point where they had reliability issues back in the day. Anybody does. And then you start to build, how do we actually run or get the value out of everything after it's in beta? We get under people's desks, right? Now we actually have to do that. So then the constraints start to produce a more focused result. And so I just think that that's where you see things like SRE develop at Google. You see operational kung fu is what enables developer experience. It's what enables people to not be in the paper. It's what enables security to have operational eyes. More and more, that integration with operations has to happen because of their scale. They have the scale, you know, in many cases, and the more of the mastery of the thing they work on, right? So it's that organizational boundary spanning, but then not making it too chaotic across our organizations so that people can't focus. And I think those signaling things are what we've been missing from fear, but also that language barrier from transcending layers of organizations, going from people that talk about ships and raising the tide that floats all the boats, and then having to figure out as a security person, what the hell does that mean? Do I build a different policy? Do I not put deny all at the end of my policy? Like, what does this mean? And reducing friction to hit goals. That sounds like me. Every time they're talking about friction, I hear me. So I think if we think about security as the way we have to do it to get value out of it, then the whole question is about, is there no value by the time we add security on? Because that could be true. But if it gets in the organization and provides value, and it doesn't necessarily have a security thought involved, like the basic, now it's out of the box and you've got to try and put stuff around it. You've got to, just the social friction is horrible. Oh, my solution was great. Now you're ruining it. You're making it harder.
I have heard that, yes.
Exactly. That's why I went with SaaS, was to not have to deal with you. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been there myself, and I realized this isn't about what it's about. This isn't right. Our basic agreement together, our social compact is screwed. And I think we have to back up with technology, because it makes things emerge the way we've run it. And things are going to keep emerging, and we're going to focus on those things. And for us to step back and go, okay, wait a minute, this isn't working. How do we really build it in? Well, it's just part of the assumption about value. So how much does it cost to make it right in the basic premise of how we get value? Because then we can make an ROI decision rather than pretend like we're going to secure something that we all know that we're not, and we haven't, because it requires money and it requires making a choice to do this and not that. And our businesses loves to throw demand at IT, undifferentiated demand.
Mm.
And then IT doesn't know how to differentiate it. We have the same problem with capabilities, tactics, and vision. And then one of the problems is that one of those groups doesn't have to compromise. And so, right, they don't have to collaborate, right? Make it so is real. And so, I think the expectations, the ball gets rolling, and by the time it hits the folks with the most focus, it's too big. The snowball, it's just too big. And so we can't even talk about it. They don't even have a word for snow. And then you've got people that are like Inuits that have 1,000 different words for snow, right? Because that's all they have, right? So yeah, I think that problem with anthropology is really a big deal. How did we get to the place where we do technology this way? And why, not with making somebody the bad person, why, assuming good intent, would it be normal for us to have these problems now? And if we create a space where we can accept it, in the past, I've been the most freaking, as an exec, I was just driving and hard. Because to be honest with you, the culture that I've worked with a lot of times is, CEOs and executives, you're going to, a lot of times you have privilege, right? And back in the day, Gene Kim really helped me out when we were dealing with execs, complain about the way our bosses would talk. And he showed me this funny little book by Stanley Bing. It's a booklet called Throwing the Elephant. And if you work with execs, it kind of frames them as the elephant, and you're the person who's there to help them. You work for them. And, I remember that one of the first premises of the book was the elephants are big. And if you walk behind an elephant, really bad stuff happens. They poop while they walk, right? I think
or you could get a nice kick in the gut as well.
And it's dirty, like dust and all this crap. And then the other thing is we've all seen, hopefully not all of us, but some of us have not seen the video of the zookeeper, and when the elephant decides to sit down and he's behind them, literally just disappears. It's terrible. And so it's a bad job to be behind elephants, right? And so the point is you have to walk beside them. And you have to walk beside them, and you have to do it in a way that doesn't freak them out, not too much farther ahead of them, a little bit behind them, right? But this notion of figuring out where to walk with the elephant is a big deal. And how to not get in their shit, right? Because everybody, when you're at the top of an organization or higher up, smaller motions generate bigger wobble at the bottom, right? There's a disproportionate, I said this, and all of a sudden everybody's like, he said this. And that means there's something different. It means this, right? So we have problems with language and problems with moving ideas, and I just think that when people can force the whole thing to happen, which is what I feel like what happens with a lot of technology, it doesn't feel like it was drawn in or adopted. It always seems like it was push crammed, and especially to the people that have to do the last things that turn out to be some of the most important things in the project, and where things often get held up because of constrained resources. So that push capability of executives and the inability of the organization, because it's all demand, to actually absorb those unplanned force or unplanned consequences or emergent consequences, right, of the work we meant to do. We actually have to do this whole thing of prioritizing in situ with things that all seem like they're an unstoppable force or an unmovable object, right? And so you've got folks that understand the millions of detail permutations at a technical level about these things. Everybody's got a different point of view. Everybody's sub-optimized to protect their own groups, like the network group, right? Here's how we convince everybody it's not our problem, right? Right, whatever it is, because every group has risk and threats.
And that's just the human condition, isn't it? That, as I was saying earlier, people don't want to be blamed for anything, because blame is shame, and we still all have that tribal mentality, and we want to be liked and admired by the group. And so anything that can put any kind of dispersions on that, we avoid, because if we're forced out the group, we're on our own, and that's a fate worse than death. And I think organizationally, we feel that quite a lot.
Yeah, tribes, I mean, they exist fundamentally to protect our individual value and our individual security. And then the tribe protects its individual value and security, right? And so the notion is that there's something that causes some sort of fear about that. And a lot of times Goldratt used to say one of the things that we often value in ourselves is we want to be reliable for other people. We don't want to be known for not being reliable. And so we estimate, we do things to protect reliability, perception in other folks, because it's not safe to not be perceived as reliable. So we pad our estimates. We do all kinds of things, right? And they're natural and they make sense when you understand the consequences that happen organizationally. And so I get it. Nobody wants conflict. Nobody wants any of those things. And oftentimes the inability to have productive conflict because of these gaps keeps us from really solving problems and gets a lot of shit swept under the rug. So I think that it's, you really start to look at what kind of conduits are you creating? Gene really talked about in the Unicorn Project, one of the things that caught me was this notion of escalations, right? It's an incredible anti-pattern. I don't know that you can really focus on them as a problem. I think there's a lot more anthropology required, right? What did we intend to do here and what's actually happening, coffee talk, right? Talk amongst yourselves. It's the thing that, is that those patterns, they put executives' names in parentheses in your value stream, right? So all of a sudden, dunk, we're moving towards value. Oh my God, we're about to get to operations. Oh wait, approval for an exception because nobody brought up it needs to use these 15 ports with these 36 attacks vectored to them, right? But it has to run by Thursday. Okay, we're gonna sign off on a crap risk, right? And so that whole notion of compromising positions is every freaking compromise we make that's basically from a premise perspective is flawed, right? The value agreement conversation wouldn't even allow us to have this conversation. It would be we missed this in the value conversation. We have to get this in there now because we had this thing happen, right? But no, instead it's, well, figure out what that thing is. And if it's going to really hurt us, then, you better tell me how long it's going to take because I'm going to have to go tell some really important person I'm going to get yelled at. And now the fear chain is activated. You've reinforced the reason for every tribe in your organization. Executives can say a sentence in an email and every tribe goes to DEFCON level. They just go like immediate nuclear launch is imminent. And then nothing happens in an organization. And you don't know why. And people get mad at the top and they start to say, we need to cut middle management because every time we want to change, the middle freezes, man. And it's like, no, every time you want to change, you want to announce that you're getting smaller. So how excited about change are you when your best friend might not show up tomorrow?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point.
Reductions. So people have actually started associating transformations with
layoffs.
With extraordinary renditions. Yeah, like what we where the
feels like corporate PTSD.
Yeah, your best friend's just not there tomorrow. Now, granted, people can get jobs in our field, but that's not the more of these transformations were happening, what I was starting to notice is they've spent a lot of money to bring in all of this great talent, especially DevOps folks, right? People that can kind of boundary span and do all this kind of cool work. And they come into this organization who can't train people to do this for some reason, can't develop people, right? Yeah. So they've created their own talent shortage. Like Andrew Clay Schaefer talks about this brilliantly. There is no talent shortage. And it's about the fact that companies don't develop people anymore. And they don't have to. They make you go through it or make somebody else pay for it, right? And they resume job. And the problem with this is that the organization repels the people that can really solve the problems. They get into this organization like, this place is stupid. Oh my gosh, security's fighting with me about controlling a laptop that's not production.
And the problem is with organizations like that as well, is when they do attract talent, they say, oh, we're on a big transformation journey. We really want to change the culture of this place. And they get people really fired up that the appetite is change, ready for it. And so you do find, obviously the kind of the most in value talent and highly respected individuals in the tech industry go, well, I'm all about culture because that's what really the tech stuff people learn, people can teach themselves. But what what makes the difference between an out-and-out techie and someone who has that little bit extra bit sparkle is that ability to be able to communicate across the different tribes, all the culture. So they go into these organizations and then they just get absolutely crushed and tombstoned, and then they leave. And so you do see these people sort of go, oh, why are all these so-called high talents always leaving? You know, they've only got a year here, you know, a year and a half, 2 years here. Well, it's because they get brought in on the false premise that they're there to do change for good and bring people on a journey, but these organizations just aren't ready.
Well, and not only that, if you look at the roadmaps for change,
Mm.
there's these incredible, silly, like hypothesis that never has been tested, right? And so the thing that I think is really interesting is what happened when the change doesn't happen. It's the people that get blamed, right? And so and then management oftentimes will start talking about those people, and then you hear phrases with the execs like, "Well, you can't fire everybody." When you realize that problem is like, oh my gosh, we are forcing a thing with very little information in a way that makes no sense socially. If you thought about this as a social problem, which it is, right? And there's no like foreshadowing of what it would look like or feel like for these people after these changes happen. There's no honesty about there's going to be less of us. Why the two things happen at the same time has always blown my mind until I figured out it's the consultancies that get brought in. They've got to pay for the freaking thing by savings.
Yeah.
So people have to get value harvested by letting people go so they can reinvest it in a transformation. Do you know where most of the transformation cuts come from? It's like operations. And because like we got to scale them more, and we did a benchmark and we're spending 3% more than our competitors. And I'm like, for what? I mean, none of that stuff makes any sense. Like if you tried to drive in the rearview mirror with benchmarks, like that is just, it's terrible, right? And so you want to talk about changing culture, you have to immediately, I found over the years that approach that like is used more in the East than in the West, your behavior changes your actual mindset. In the West, we believe we got to get everybody in a room, get on the same page, and get a mindset, and then go execute, because we'll know how to be together. And I'm like, no, it just doesn't work. Continually, it does not work with social things. It is not a football game where you can script the first 20 plays and feel good about it. Like this is a situation where things are going to emerge. And so how are you as a team going to have the social safety nets to deal with it? And how are you even going to actually have productive conflict? Because the notion that consensus is the gatekeeper is crazy, because when you talk about the cascading ability for knowledge, like who gets to say no at what points? And if you don't have enough autonomy in the organization for people to realize that guy who's talking, who only talks in a language I don't understand and is really worried about stuff, has a really, really valuable no in this, because he's basically saying the value equation is screwed right now. There's way more risk and way more uncertainty than what we can handle. And believe me, since I'm the person who's going to get the stick when this happens from you, probably, I'm just trying to tell you that we don't need to have that happen. Like we can actually fix this problem, right? Like, and so, but it's so much of a conflict to say no, because tech can't say no, but yet they always have to. But where are they saying no? The project's 80% of the way to being done. That's what the organization forces.
I feel that I think Martin Fowler or somebody else recently did say about they feel like there's been a great perversion in agile. Allegedly, their initial ideas were to bring business and technology together to actually have like a mediated relationship between the two.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's been perverted to now it has just become a stick to beat technology with, and they've lost any kind of control over it.
Well, it's also, if you think about this, I have a little bit more cynical view based on my interactions with management over the years, which is that if you talk among management folks, a lot of them will agree that the problem is in delivering value is that IT is just too slow. Okay, it just takes too long for them, for our own people especially. It's kind of like a small town syndrome where we're just not as smart as everybody else is, but at the same time, don't tell us there's a better way, right? Because we're provincial, right? But the the kind of crazy setup that you get with that kind of layer mistranslation is just amazing. And everybody's pitting themselves against each other instead of, like I said, understanding that and actually having some layer of belief about where people fit into a system and how you guys get things done. Like if I'm a CEO, I want headlights. I mean, I want headlights. I always have a saying, I would rather have headlights than airbags, right? I don't want to know about a problem when I'm right. Like I want to know when it's out there. And if I have great headlights, I have time to react. And so we want to actually, as a business, give ourselves more time to solve problems before we hit the end of a project. And the way that happens is the way we go into them, the way we go into the project together. And if we don't understand what our roles do to create value in the project, we're going to actually diminish people's roles for expediency on delivery. And then later have the excuse of, well, I had no idea. I mean, why didn't you guys say something? Well, because we can't say no to you when you get this angry. Like we're always the problem. You can't deliver on time. Literally everything you said in an email that you thought was a positive change management email activated all of our tribes. And they all went, it's not good for us to do this right now. Let's slow walk. You don't even have to say it. It's just like, it's too dangerous. It's too hot. And so, and then I also think the other thing is Agile is cynically adopted by the business as basically IT is too slow. Agile sounds faster. Everything that makes you more agile, let's do that. Oh, so we got to get trained. Oh, we got to bring in some consultants and some coaches. Cool, but you're going to get faster, right? Never mind, we don't even know what faster means. Faster just means that the project's done to them. And the problem is that, we saw this with some of these great books from IT Revolution. Like the problem is not the project. And that's all the execs cares about. Get it up. I want the value. I want to get the value. Get me to the value, right? And the way we do the project often precludes us getting value. And then the other thing is when it's done, it's not a product. We just think it's done. And now next year ops is coming back going, you bought 1 year of maintenance.
Yes.
Got a 20% VIG on this thing. What? Well, can we not buy maintenance? Can we, go by a year till we have it in the budget, or 6 months, or?
Well, one thing I always say is, quick and easy is how you bake a cake, or is what you should be aiming for. It's not how you bake in security.
Yeah, I feel it always seems to be really perverse when I have a meeting with a potential client and it goes, this is going to be the entire key for our business strategy, linchpin for us going forward for the next number of years. We have decided that you can deliver this in 3 months and you have £100,000. And you go, okay. But your turnover is many multiples of that. And you're saying this is your key strategic item, and it needs to be right. And I feel like there's like some very perverse thinking going on there.
I had a friend, John Latterback, who was a CIO at Wild Oats, which was in the United States was one of the precursor competitors to Whole Foods, which became like a crazy, it's a natural food store that is corporate and big, and now Amazon owns them. And that we used to jokingly call them whole paycheck, because you go in to buy all of your organic things and your money's gone, right? But he used to say at Wild Oats is that I tell management that IT is cheap like a puppy is free. Right?
Yes, yeah, I love that. I'm using that.
About open source too. I mean, like literally, he's just like, okay, great. How much do we want to roll ourselves? And then how much do we want to inherit these 5 parts of the life cycle that are implicitly assumed if you take your stuff and roll it yourself? Like he's like, we don't have those capabilities now because you guys were impatient and bought a lot of off-the-shelf software, right? And didn't want to do this. Now all of a sudden you have these compelling transformation needs, and we have no talent for that. And not only that, we don't have any systems to absorb that. And so what often would happen is the pet to the CEO and to the CMO, to the other teams and whatever transformations involved, the pet to them is the thing that makes the transformation happen in their minds. Oversimplify. What's the thing we don't have that we need to make this happen? Oh, well, developers. Oh, okay. So we got to go hire these really expensive. Gosh, they're really expensive. But I mean, we need this. Okay, so we're going to do this. We got to hire all these developers. They're going to make stuff we don't have, new stuff. And oh, by the way, so operations, what money have you saved me? Cool. No discussion about all the novelty that they're about to get. So the exact focus is on improving and or actually adding new capabilities that are going to get him shiny stuff, doesn't understand that now finance unknowingly has set up a battle between operations, who's paid to make things scale and operate with less people, more stuff, secure, no papers, right? No outages, 100% availability with no real understanding of what that should cost, right? But they've got this whole notion, very brittle thinking, and then like, you're trying to make all of this work, but you're giving all of this money to your developers who are going to make you agile because they're fast, and the developers start to complain about this problem with operations. This becomes the old narrative, right? Of
Yeah.
operations made, they're paid on scale. So how do you get scale? Less variation, more mastery, right? So you standardize. Standardizing thinking is all about having to scale. Like, the less unique things we have, the more mastery we can have over the things we do. It's not hard, right? And so the operational focus is that. But when you go over to the software development focus, their focus is making all these new things. Novelty. So what are they creating? Literally the opposite type of situation that you're paying your operations people for. And the conflict is basic. It's not about ITIL. It's not about any of these things that people love to complain about. It's about change. And I'm not paid to take that kind of change. I cannot absorb variation in a scale machine. That is the basic premise. And nobody has this conversation. Jabe Bloom is one of my partners in other business, and I worked together at Red Hat. And he basically understood that there's three economies that's operating there, right? You've got a development and you've got an operational economy, paid differently, incentivized completely the opposite. And no wonder they can't understand each other. It's like a rich kid going to a poverty-stricken neighborhood and going, well, why don't you guys have Cheetos? Right? Like,
Yes.
And so, that whole enmity, just, they get all the toys. Not only that, but there's all these rules now that are getting broken. I've got developers saying they control their own systems. Like, what is happening? Right. And all, these new tools. And so there's a natural conflict set up. And, one of the things that Jabe talked about in his three kind of economies was the creation of a platform economy in the middle to kind of act as a clutch for variation. So operations really knows how to scale and operate platforms, love them because they aggregate lots of use cases into smaller, manageable chunks. And then when you allow the platform on the developer side to actually become the place where that actually slows down some of the novelty. In other words, we already have that on the platform. We already have this capability. No, we do not need a new authorization platform. No more databases, like all of these kinds of things, right? No more user databases. And so just really, really those kinds of things that a platform kind of allows that shift, a gear shift to happen, like a clutch between the two, and slows down the amount of interaction about basic things. All of a sudden, you don't have developers calling operations about primitives like storage and RAM and memory because they're operating a platform. Platform doesn't have enough memory. They're going to notice. As a matter of fact, the other thing that, was really brilliant was this notion of recommoning, which when we were at Red Hat, the notion of internal open sourcing, really big deal, right? And so like, if I build a thing as an ops guy to help me run the platform, I could give it to you as a platform person to know that it's running correctly. And then you might make it available to a developer so that they don't have to ask you if it's running correctly. So like, we are all writing for each other and we're contributing to this thing, building up capabilities and going, hey, I don't know if you could use this, but you should if you want to, because it's cool and it does these things. So that's that's us working to make the system to work together versus the catabolic opposition and contention about change. That's a flow.
We've all got that kind of. We need to have skin in the game in every sense of this. And security, as I say, we do need to compromise as well if we want to get some of these initiatives on board. Kevin, I have to admit that there is totally a reason why you wrote the Phoenix Project in the way you did with your co-authors. You have been an absolute master of metaphor, and I am going to steal so many. I'm going to steal so many of them. I'm sure our listeners will do too. You have been incredibly generous with your time, and I thank you so much for being our first launch guest on this show. It's been an absolute pleasure. If people want to find you, where can they find you?
I think LinkedIn is probably the best at this point. Our world has gotten really fragmented with platforms. So that's where I'm at, and I'm fairly active on there, and actually even respond to messages occasionally. So yeah, I think that's the best place to probably engage with me.
Wonderful. And also, I'd be remiss not to again plug the Phoenix Project as a fantastic book. I do literally give it to new starters and say, you know, if you don't know anything about the tech industry, start here. It is very, very approachable. I recently, in the organization I worked in, used it as my first book for a book club aimed at, you know, non-technical staff understanding the sort of the tech transformation we're undergoing in our organization at the moment, and people who said, you know, I'm frightened of tech, read your book and said, I get it now. I understand what all the different parts do and everything like that. And then they asked me when I'm going to shave my head, which is a little in joke to people who have read the book. Thank
no
you
longer
again
of
so
tech, now
much.
frightened of people.
That's amazing.
When am I going to go off the rails and shave my head?
I
Yeah.
see that
Not that bad yet.
Right, from IT crowd, right? I do believe that he's a creation of that too. But yeah, thank you for saying that. And you know, again, I think the big thing as you're reading Phoenix Project and you want to try and understand somebody across a different divide from you, just look at the conversations that happen and how they start in management, and then where they go and how they end up for people like Brent. Right? You don't know how many people have sent me messages over the years saying, well, as long as we fire Brent, we're going to be fine. Because I was just like, no, dude, the system creates this behavior, and people that care wind up getting victimized out of the system. And so then they get cynical, right? So I just think that you know, it's a blast working on problems like this together, and I really enjoy working with the execs and understanding that metaphor, while it is funny and it is a fast way to move information, it is low fidelity. And so trying to maintain fidelity with our metaphors so that people that don't understand them, so that the reason you're using them in the first place doesn't become the impediment to actually having them be helpful. I've listened to so many exec repeat things that they've heard me say or somebody else say in the wrong context. And not only is it embarrassing, but sometimes it takes weeks to recover from other people hearing these things. Right. And so, you know, it's hard. We're all going to make mistakes. And I think that's the big thing is, what are we going to do when we make a lot of mistakes together? How are we going to act? And because that's what transformation is it's a series of, you know, hopefully planned experiments that don't result in something that is way too exothermic for all of us to handle. We'd rather have them be endothermic and happen in small, contained, inward facing things. But anyway, yeah, so it's fun. And anytime you guys want to talk, I'm up for it.
Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
There was like 1,000,001 questions I did want to ask you, but unfortunately time does not permit. But before everyone goes, I just want to remind everyone you can now find us on all good podcasting platforms available to subscribe. This episode should be on there very shortly, and also future episodes. We're also on some not very good podcast platforms. If anyone wants to go there, if there's any podcast platforms that we are not on and you want us to be on, let me know. Thank you so much for Leeds Digital Festival for helping support this event. Thank you to everyone that's been an absolute champion throughout this whole process. Do follow us for more amazing content. We do this for the love. You know, we are not getting paid for this. We're not being sponsored by anyone. It's actually costing us money to put the stuff like this on, but we really want to get that message out there that we can do security differently and more collaboratively. So thank you very much for everyone that has stayed on this call. Thank you so much to our very esteemed guest. I hope you didn't notice how much I was fangirling out, but it's been a long time coming, and your book is very, very inspirational to me. And thank you to my co-host Jeff as well.
Thank you, you guys.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.